Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining How Can Retailers Best Leverage AI with Rogayeh Tabrizi, CEO and founder of Theory+Practice. As a reminder, if you have any questions throughout the conversation, to please submit them using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research, to kick it off.
Thank you, Drew, and thanks to all of you for joining us for today's, what I think will be a very exciting and interesting conversation. It really is more important than ever for retailers and brands and really the whole, kind of retail and retail tech ecosystem to understand what customers want, how they want it, and when they want it. I mean, really, this is the kind of ultimate opportunity for all of us to understand the customer. Coresight has been exploring this holy grail and really the importance of AI and data-driven insights to achieve this and how we can all work together to do that. I was truly honored to meet Rogayeh, and Theory+Practice is a very unique organization. They are truly able to knit together this journey for retailers to take, really based on data-driven insights. And it helps everyone, right, kind of take a direct line versus the circuitous route. And what we believe will prove to be a very unique holiday season, this opportunity to have a trusted partner is truly more important than ever. I'm honored to have Rogayeh Tabrizi, co-founder and CEO of Theory+Practice, with us today. In terms of her background, she has a PhD in economics, a Master's of Science in Experimental Particle Physics, which you don't often hear from those working in the retail industry. While working towards her PhD as a kind of more effective way to engender positive change in the world, she really became fascinated with game theory and the behavioral patterns in social networks. As a result, as she looked to find, these uncovering these hidden trends, really the, kind of unveiling insights and indicators to better serve customer needs during her tenure as a behavioral economist, Rogayeh was truly inspired to marry her skills, leading to her co-founding of Theory+Practice. Additionally, and in some ways more importantly, Rogayeh is very passionate about fostering social good. She has worked with a number of nonprofit agencies and social networks. She is the chair of the board of directors for Human Security Research Project and a trusted advisor for Impacton, as well as involved with Engineers Without Borders. So truly, not only dedicating a lot of her time to changing the path forward for retailers, but also the path forward for humanity, really. Her experience also includes blockchain-based platforms, extensive consulting, data science, and really a never-ending focus on ROI. And as Drew mentioned, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen for any questions that arise, and we'll address these during the Q&A portion of the webinar. And Rogayeh, I truly want to offer you a warm welcome to joining us today.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Thank you very much for that introduction.
Absolutely. So with that introduction and really kind of understanding a bit better what motivates you, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for Theory+Practice?
It really is in the name. It's about the theory and practice, right? As you mentioned, so I come from this mixed background of physics and economics. And I remember when I actually started in economics, one of the things I quickly realized was that I haven't been taught or trained to ask questions. What I mean by that is, in physics, I used to go back and forth to CERN, and I was really lucky. I kept reflecting back on that period in my life that I would wake up to 20 terabytes of data. And, the question, though, was always given. The job really was to extract signals out of a lot of tons of data in order to find signatures for Higgs boson, right? But when I started in economics, I was like, okay, so what is the question? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do research on? And I remember just talking with my advisors, and every single time I would put a model in front of them and they would tell me, but what is the question? What is the question? So, it just, when I left academia and, with this mixed background, what I realized is very much missing in this space is that a lot of people with technical backgrounds, I'm kind of pointing finger at myself, we haven't been really taking time to understand what are the questions we're asking, why are we even asking those questions, why do we think those questions are important enough to be the basis or the guiding principles for our algorithms. So with that, you're right, I am obsessed with the ROI and the value because it's always about the to what end. If you don't think about the to what end from the very beginning and actually convince yourself that you understand your own assumptions, that you have been transparent about those assumptions, you're not going to be able to really have an impact. You're going to build a model, it's going to kind of work, you're kind of going to implement it, you know, but you're going to end up in a world that is you're not going to be transparent.
You know, in an environment where, let's be honest, we all have many questions right now, as you're working with retailers and brands, how do you help them, you know, really focus on the question that will have the greatest ROI if they can answer it properly? And, you know, as they answer one, right, kind of then, if you will, cascading or waterfalling down to the next question, because ultimately I think the way that you frame this, it's all about asking the right question, even if we sometimes don't like the answer, and then figuring out you know, kind of what to do to kind of take it to the next level. How do you kind of work through that process?
That's a really good question. I remember, let me tell you a story. I remember very early on, one of our first clients was a retailer. I used to come to New York really often for meeting with the client, and some of our first conversations was, we want to do segmentation. So that was the question. I'm like, well, that's not exactly a question. Sure, tell me why you want to do segmentation. Interesting. Well, we need to understand our customers. Okay, well, what do you exactly want to understand about the customers? You know, what kind of behaviors are you actually puzzling you about your interactions with the customers? You kind of go down that rabbit hole, and what ended up happening was that what they thought people's perception of the brand was really not aligned with their pricing strategy. So there was a very big gap, which basically translated in a lot of discount shopping behavior. Here we're talking about a luxury retailer. You know, a small bag would cost you about $1,000, right? So you don't necessarily want to train your clients and your customers to be discount shoppers. So, okay, now I understand why you're puzzled about why, you know, this is the thing that you're saying. So then it starts, when you have identified the right question, sure, I'm still going to start with the segmentation because it is a good way of really trying to understand the customers, but there is a to what end to it. So I'm going to come and combine data sets that if I didn't know, I'm trying to figure out the problems around discount shopping behavior. I wouldn't have gone after those data sets, right? So the whole thing, the whole process from asking the right question guides you to something that I call minimum viable data. When you have a roadmap, you get to go to data targeted. So it not becomes about boiling the ocean. A lot of retailers, fortunately or unfortunately, think that you know, most of these journeys is about big data, and we don't have the infrastructure, or you know, just the cost is a lot, and on, right? So I can go around a whole bunch of, like, you know, issues and problems that I hear often from retailers. But the thing is, if you actually know what the question is, you can go to data targeted. Instead of working with 100 data sets, you end up working with 10 data sets.
Well, this idea around, right, minimum viable data, I think of, you know, kind of a short period of time. We're going to see what we can collect, what that looks like, and then be, you know, kind of very targeted and focus on enablement. Is that the kind of method to the madness, or how do you think about it?
Very much so. You're asking me about, okay, what is the right question? It's actually hard to begin with to understand what the right question is. You always need to validate your own assumptions. Well, how do you validate the assumptions? Do you want to take 6 months to just validate something that you may or may not work? Or do you want to take 1 month? So there's another reason for why you want to go to data a little bit more targeted, and in order to really save the time and save the cost. And you want to experiment. You know, we kept talking about being agile, but how would you be agile when it comes to AI, right? So it's just all of those sort of things. It takes several months sometimes to train the data, to train the model, right? So I really want to make sure that my models, I'm not throwing 5,000 variables at my models. I want to throw less than 50. I want to have an understanding of how these sort of systems work, right?
Well, and as you think about that, how do you think about implementing AI to help retailers and brands avoid, major pitfalls and costly mistakes?
It's interesting because there are two different kind of pitfalls I actually think about. One is in terms of the strategic direction of the organization. So can AI actually help us to comb through tons of data to find patterns that we haven't even, it's practically would be impossible to find those sort of patterns manually and use those information and actual signals to make better decisions? Sure, we can do that. However, there are actual pitfalls associated to AI as well. And if we don't pay attention to and that's why I kept going back to what is our assumptions? Do we actually even understand what goes into our models? Because the AI itself can create a whole bunch of other pitfalls and unintended consequences. So there are two different kind of pitfalls that we want to really pay attention to. Short answer to the first one, can AI actually help? I think it can, but it only can help if you're really careful and you know what you're throwing at it.
Well, oftentimes we hear about this idea of, kind of bias or unconscious bias in AI. And maybe that goes back to this idea of unintended consequences. How do you think through that?
This question always makes me smile. I remember I was actually in New York a while ago and I was on a panel. Somebody asked about, a poll just came up. I'm just going to close this poll in front of me. Somebody asked about, bias and AI. And, there was a few other panelists and they were just absolutely brilliant and everybody was just answering the question. But most of the questions was around how would you solve for bias? And I eventually kind of literally raised my hand. I was like, I'm probably the only economist in the room. Maybe the physicist in me is why I'm allowed to be in this room. But, the thing is, when I think about bias, actually the question at first I ask myself is what causes bias? Where does bias come from? Well, assumptions, potentially untested assumptions. If you actually want to test your assumptions, you need to know that you are making assumptions to begin with. In order to understand that you are making the assumptions, you need to be able to ask questions that uncover your assumptions. So that whole process is something that is simply not taught by, in programs that people go and basically get stamped that they're data scientists. Nothing wrong with it. Again, I'm really excited that people see the opportunity in this field, but it is really important for us to pay attention to how we are building methodology in order to experiment. And I'm not talking about, just scientific, pure curiosity-driven research here. I'm talking about tangible things and safeguards that you have to put in place in order to understand what is the kind of data that enters your algorithms. And after you have trained the model, how you're going to do some sort of test, sanity check, baselining, in order to really convince yourself that they are not variables, inputs that are indirectly biasing your algorithms, because no one sits behind their laptop, starts programming with the intention that I'm just going to create a biased algorithm. Nobody does that.
Well, it's very interesting as, you and I have talked about how you've developed your organization and this idea around kind of removing bias. You talked about, having an intellectually diverse team. Can you kind of drill down on that? Because I think it's a really enlightening way to think about, diversity. And, then how do you basically get kind of the best algorithms and, the best outcomes for your clients?
Thank you for that. I think it basically originated from my own painful process of transitioning from physicist to being an economist. There is a lot of wisdom in having people from different backgrounds and fields sit together. And not just merely, hey, I kind of listen to you and sure I understand. No, I wanted to have a physicist sit with an economist, sit with a computer scientist, and actually sit with a biologist. They do stats differently. Just can we actually come and look at a problem from 4 or 5 different angles and just really convince each other again and ourselves that we're asking the right question. Because when you have that kind of a brain power in the room, when we're thinking about edge thinking, really, it is important to consider that a physicist would look at a problem very differently than an economist. But that combination is where magic happens to me. And, I have seen it even in my team, right? Because It is a hard thing to do that. It is hard because we are, again, the language is different, the jargon is different. There are a lot of things that is different about, the fields that we all kind of grew up in and got educated in. But the point around this is, can I suspend my own perceptions and assumptions for just a second and actually listen to a person who's looking at a problem from a different angle? If I manage to do that, the odds are I can combine that with the stuff that I know. And then I can hopefully communicate it in a way that comes up with a better plan that I was just, originally sitting and thinking about.
That's incredibly helpful. As we start to think about, well, we're kind of in the holiday season, and everyone's, done so much in terms of preparations. What questions or what challenges are you being asked to solve, or kind of to take a fresh look at? And how is that different than what you expected to be working on right now?
I wanted to make a joke, Deborah. It's don't laugh at me, but I was like, 2 years ago, I would have never thought that I would be working on any of these problems to begin with. So, but that aside.
So true.
That's right. If my supervisors just knew, right?
Right.
But no, seriously, people in academia would only wish to had access to the kind of problems and the kind of data that we really have access to. And that to me is why we get to attract, so many brilliant individuals to the team, because the questions are really difficult. The problems are actually very challenging. I mean, with pandemic right now, questions that in the last year this time, the questions that I was getting was dramatically different from questions that I'm getting right now. So right now it is a lot of changes that I have seen is migrating from offline to online to digital. The challenges and problems associated to it. Some retailers have done a much better job transitioning, or they had maybe both platforms or both avenues and channels to reach out to their customers. But a lot of retailers are not necessarily in that space. And then comes the question of, well, we don't have a lot of online data on our customers. What are we going to do? Well, it's not about online or offline data. It's that you actually have data on your customers through some sort of interactions that you've had. So it's about understanding how you can translate, again, the information into signals that is going to generate a better experience for your customers now through the online platform, right? Of course, the whole integration around it, just building the ecosystem around it is challenging. I'm not trying to make it seem like a simple thing. It definitely requires a lot of effort from a lot of different teams. But some of the questions that we are getting right now is very much around navigating the online world, customer experience. Some of the questions very much is around understanding customer intent and customer journey. Are you going to treat your customers and their quote-unquote personas or the segments that you have as something static, or are you actually going to think about it as a dynamic entity that is really changing quite fast? So how do you understand and extract information about those phase transitions so that you're proactive about your customers' needs and wants and the preferences that are changing very quickly? Retention is another big question. I mean, it's always with retail, but especially in this environment.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because, while returns have always been there, especially going back to this online and offline, it sounds, like we're getting more questions. And I think you have too around how to predict, right, if a certain customer is going to return an item and what can be done in the interim to, kind of control that. And then, how do you, right, this whole idea of, product offering and suggestive selling, there's so many questions that are coming up, especially as we go into holiday. What has been your experience with some of those specific questions?
Let me take a step back. I promise I'm going to answer your question. I think one of the things that I want to focus is, as important as these questions are, perhaps the more important piece is the to what end. It's not about just the algorithm. A lot of people are asking us about recommendation systems. You know, you have brand new customers. I don't have much data on it. How can I recommend, or how can I optimize my systems around it? The question around return you're asking has been a very important one, especially with holiday season. And can we actually predict who's going to return what before they even purchased it? Because we want to have a handle on our inventory. We know it's going to impact our customer experience, etc. All of those questions are very important. But again, the other piece is, what is the objective function for you? What is it that you're trying to optimize? Are you wanting to optimize and maximize or enhance your customer experience? Do you want to get a handle on your costs and do cost saving? Do you want to just increase sales and revenues? Because depending on what your to what end is, a different intervention can actually be more appropriate. So again, that's why I say, let's start from the end. What is our to what end? Who is actually going to benefit of one way or the other? Who are we trying to enable through these interventions, through these different systems? And from there, try to backward engineer and see what is actually, is a recommendation system a better thing here? Or do you just like want a simple, I don't know, just if then a statement hardwire into a system? Why spend a lot of money when you can solve it with something quite simple, right?
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to ask 2 more questions and then turn it over to audience Q&A. So audience, please get your questions ready. But, you know, this all sounds very complex, and, you know, that, you know, despite this idea around minimum viable data, that it would take a long time to actually implement, you know, some of these suggestions. Can you talk about, you know, the length of a typical engagement for you?
Our engagements typically, especially around the kind of questions that we're talking about, is around 3 to 4 months.
That's really quick when you consider the ROI associated with that. That's really impressive. And then, you know, one other, you know, kind of, and there's so many questions that everyone's asking right now, but truly customer loyalty has been one, and this idea that AI can really drive customer loyalty and increase share and average order value. But how do you see that being done by, you know, kind of predicting and modeling changes in consumer behavior?
You almost answered the question. If you're going to go after loyalty, you need to understand why customers are loyal, why loyal customers stay, why some of them leave. So there's actually, and to me, it's very positive. There is a lot of movement toward not just understanding or not wanting just a score, but wanting to understand the why behind that score. If I'm scoring your loyalty on a scale of 1 to 10, I want to understand what are the driving factors of that 10. So, which goes back to this idea of how can we hit several different birds with one stone? Can we actually pick a question that answering that question is going to generate enough signals? And the outputs from those models can actually be inputs to a whole bunch of other models, right? And that's why it's really about maximizing models that can be used in multiple different ways. The information from them are not just toward a point solution. Like one of the most, like if I want to say one last thing around this is we really have to start shifting our thinking from let's solve a point problem. I just need a solution for this thing right here, right now, to taking a step back and be like, well, what is the one question that if I answered that question, 5 other things are going to be taken care of, right? Because with that, and it really isn't, it doesn't need to take too much longer than just answering the point problem. And, you know, the question, if I want to go back to your previous question around how long it takes, there's a reason we define problems and, you know, at least initial engagements very short. Data is risky. If you don't know what you're working with, you really want to get a handle on what is the animal you're dealing with, right? So, and it's much better to go to it again, target it, have a specific questions, but hopefully that question is aligned with your strategic objective. And then from there, the roadmap opens up.
Great. So we're going to turn it to the audience Q&A as I look through and thank you everyone for kind of engaging with us on the Q&A side. There are many questions, Rogayeh, around, and I know you can only be so specific, but either types of retailers, types of companies that you've worked with, and engagements, and, you know, this idea of tangible examples, and, you know, anything on the ROI, but as much as you can provide, I think the audience would appreciate.
Sure. We have worked with retailers that have, let's say, are 5 different continents, really all over the place, data coming from all over the place, and you know, around $1 billion revenue to $6 billion revenue to Fortune 10 companies. So, you know, in terms of like the scale of companies, we've definitely worked with a lot of different organizations that have actually their own even data science teams. We usually partner. Well, it's actually the best because we become best friends with their own internal teams. They know the data that much better anyway. Two, we also have worked with organizations that maybe their data science teams or their AI teams was just at the beginning of their journey, and we help to train them and just, you know, take them to the next level. In terms of the tangible examples, some of the questions that we talked about, predicting return around discount shopping behavior, deep segmentation, understanding journey, intent, multiple recommendation systems, it goes on and on. But again, really not about the algorithms, it's a question.
Right. Now, and this is a great question because I feel that so many companies make so many decisions based on this. And this question's from Jeff. Is a valid question that the net promoter question, right? Would you recommend us to a friend? How do you think about that, right? So many companies make such significant decisions based on this. And how do you feel about that?
It's a great question. So my own research is on networks, right? So it's, to me, those sort of measures are really interesting. But given that, how the net promoter score is actually usually defined and at what stage it is defined. Oftentimes, unfortunately, this score is just defined at the very end of the experience. You're done with your shopping and all of that. And, you know, the idea is that, sure, you know, we're trying to understand how was that entire journey. But well, if I had a really, really bad checkout experience, guess what? But, you know, the net promoter, you know, if you're looking at a KPI, it doesn't necessarily tell me where in the journey you can actually create improvements. So when it comes to the KPIs and the kind of KPIs that you really want to use in order to decide, you know, where is the actionable place? It's really hard because of the way it's usually defined. However, there are ways of bringing the very same kind of thinking, because I actually do believe in the peer effect and how individuals influence each other, especially in the context of retail. I don't think it's a bad measure, but usually how it is defined is not quite appropriate.
No, that's incredibly helpful. A question from Mark is, how important is AI transparency to customers and aligning with their intent, journey, and brand awareness?
To me, it again really it depends on to what end of the organization. What is it exactly we're trying to achieve? I remember we were talking with one of our clients and I told her that I'm going to borrow and use this phrase that she kept using. Her objective was to create delight. Well, then my job was like to translate delight into something that you can actually get out of data, right? But if you want to actually really enhance your customer experience, what does exactly transparency in AI mean? When you have a recommendation system in front of me, I know that it's using a lot of my own information and a lot of other people's information. Is that going to generate delight and actually enhance my customer experience? Well, if I bought a TV, don't show me a TV again, right? There are so many examples, right, like that depends on, well, partly people know that there are algorithms behind their experience or behind what it is that they see. Are they going to game it? Is that, you know, with the return example, that is a tricky one, because if I actually want to reduce return for 2 different reasons, because I want to save costs, but I also, returning is never a good experience, right? So actually minimizing returns can enhance customer experience as well. So the intervention that I may choose in order to address that, if people know that there is an intervention in place, some people may try to game it. So how do you go around that, right? So there's let me put my economist hats on. It depends.
Great answer. I am going to wrap it up with 2 last questions, but both are really interesting. You know, how do you track ROI? Because ultimately that will help retailers understand, right, when to invest, where to invest, and at what point in their journey to invest.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I've been using this whole expression of to what end quite often. Again, the economist in me thinks about calculating ROI at 2 different points in time. One, ex ante, like before we actually get started. They are usually a set of different questions, set of different avenues. Sometimes the question is really clear, it's in front of you, and at least anecdotally you know that it's going to generate some sort of value. And the challenge becomes, how are you going to construct the roadmap in order to get there? But ex ante, can you actually get a handle on using a few transparent assumptions that what kind of ROI you may actually return or create for this? And then expose after the algorithm is built. There's usually ways of actually using the very same models or creating models that predict the ROI out of the outcomes of those models. Then you get to go experiment and actually test it. So I'm very big on baselining everything that you do at the very beginning, throughout the entire process, but there are ways of actually calculating the ROI so that you know. And you can actually use the very same calculation to decide what kind of interventions is going to generate a higher ROI for you.
Great. I'm going to sneak in a question because as I look through all of them, there's a lot around facial recognition technology. So I'll take this one from Andy. Can facial recognition technology be useful in providing information about a customer before they reach POS?
Well, again, it depends. So if you're dealing with online experience and, so I'm assuming we're not going to address some of the ethical components that comes into picture here. So putting that aside, can you actually extract information about an individual's feeling and individual's kind of experience as they are going? Yes, there are people that are working on those sort of advanced experiences. How are you going to really use that information in order to enhance the journey? In all honesty, I think there are ways of, there are more low-hanging fruits there that you can actually go, to your current data to really try to understand what actually creates better experience for the customers. Substitution is a really big one. Oftentimes individuals are really not happy, customers are really not happy with the items that are being substituted or being shown to them. Just fixing that problem is going to save so much money, it costs a lot, and it's going to enhance customer experience. But do I think there is definitely opportunities in facial recognition? I think there is.
Great. All right. So this will be our concluding question, but there are still so many, and sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's. But I think this is a nice way to finish. How will the pandemic accelerate AI and ML adoption, and what big ideas are emerging?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it definitely has brought this whole conversation forefront of individual. I mean, I know of colleagues, for example, in UK, that there were organizations that digital transformation was a 5-year plan or an 8-year plan, and now it's like planned right now. It's a plan yesterday, right? So there has been a lot. The pandemic has definitely created different environments for people to truly explore whether there is an actual benefit in bringing these sort of algorithms. And again, I go back to that to what end question. Let's really understand what is it that we want to get out of it before we spend a lot of money on implementing algorithms or building big data systems, stuff like that. If you're not careful about it, you're going to waste a lot of money. That's the short of that. In terms of big opportunities, I think understanding customer behavior and customer journey so that we can figure out where are opportunities for intelligent interventions, intelligent decisioning in order to actually enhance customer experience. So that's one of the themes that's coming up a lot in conversations right now.
Well, Rogayeh, I want to thank you, this idea around minimum viable data, intellectual diversity, and this kind of so many times when retailers get involved with different projects, they have a very long kind of lifespan. This idea that they can really take kind of data to dollars and result in 4 months with you is truly amazing. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for all of your sharing, and you have an amazing background, and hope to hear from you again soon.
Thank you so much, Deborah. It was a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.